On the morning of July 11, 1944, in a hayfield outside Isigny, Normandy, a captured German Panther tank sat motionless, its long 75mm gun pointed at nothing. 2 weeks earlier, cattle had grazed in that field. Now a row of American officers in pressed uniforms stood at the tree line, watching a Sherman tank roll into position 200 yards out. This Sherman carried the brand new 76mm gun the gun ordnance officers had sworn would handle anything the Germans could field. The first round fired, then the second, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth. 6 armor-piercing rounds struck the Panther's sloped front plate at nearly 2,600 feet per second, and 6 rounds skipped off into the hedge like flat stones thrown across still water. The Panther sat untouched, scorched paint, nothing more. 9 days later, General Dwight Eisenhower held that report in his hands at his headquarters in southern England, and the men in the room would later say they had never heard him angrier. Somewhere in Normandy, at that exact hour, young American tank crews were dying because a promise had just failed in a quiet field full of cattle tracks and gun smoke. The answer already existed. It was sitting in a locked crate outside Boston, and almost none of the men who needed it yet knew it was there. Before we dive in, get comfortable and grab your favorite warm drink. Now, check the time. What does your clock say right now? Leave it in the comments. And let's step back into World War II together. The report on the Isigny demonstration reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower, 53 years old, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. In writing, it confirmed on paper what he had already been told 9 days earlier. In the wood, paneled quiet of his headquarters in southern England, Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins, Commander of the United States 7th Corps, had walked into that office and said the same thing out loud. Our new gun cannot kill their new tank. Witnesses who were present that day and who recorded the moment in 3 separate accounts afterward remembered the change that came over Eisenhower's face. The color rose. His Jafset. He looked up from his desk and asked, in a voice gone low and quiet, whether they meant to tell him the 76mm gun could not knock out a Panther he had been promised in writing more than once that it could handle anything in the German inventory. He had passed that promise down through every layer of his command. Now he understood the promise had been wrong, and somewhere across the channel in hedgerow country he had never walked, young men were paying for it. To understand how the United States Army arrived at that hayfield in Isigny with 6 dead rounds and a live Panther, the story has to step backward 6 months to January of 1944, when the first Sherman tanks fitted with the new 76mm M1 gun began rolling off American assembly lines. The gun itself was not new. Ordnance engineers had developed it through 1943, after field reports out of Tunisia and Sicily made one thing clear. The standard 75mm gun that had carried the Sherman through North Africa and Italy was running out of margin. German armor was getting thicker, and the American medium tank needed more punch to match it. By February of 1944, the new 76mm Shermans were crossing the Atlantic to depots in southern England. By the 10th of April, 130 of them sat waiting there. Paint, still, factory fresh. Engines never run in combat, ready to be issued to units training for the invasion of France. They were never issued, not before the landings. The decision came from Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, 51 years old, commander of the 1st United States Army. Bradley believed his Sherman crews needed more time to train on an unfamiliar weapon before trusting it in battle. He believed that supplying 2 different types of tank ammunition across the invasion beaches at the exact moment the entire logistics of an amphibious assault would already be strained past reason was a risk not worth taking, and most of all, He believed the 75mm gun would be enough for whatever waited in Normandy. Because his own intelligence section had told him so, American estimates placed Panther tanks at a small fraction of German armor in the West. A nuisance. The reports called them not a real threat. When American soldiers came ashore on June 6th, the true figure was closer to 40% of the German medium tanks in the theater. By the second week of fighting, the bodies of American tank crews were coming out of burning Shermans in numbers. Nobody at Bradley's headquarters had prepared for. The lesson reached the crews themselves faster than it reached anyone above them. The 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther's front armor at any range that mattered. When a Sherman met a Panther head-on in the hedgerows, where the tangled banks of earth and thorn sometimes closed the range to 50 yards, the choice came down to two options. Maneuver fast enough to find the thinner armor on the Panther's side, or die trying to. The hedgerows themselves became part of the problem. Norman farmers had spent centuries building earthen banks topped with tangled thorn to fence their cattle, and those banks now cut the countryside into a maze of blind corners. No tactical manual had prepared American crews for. A Sherman could not see a Panther waiting on the far side of a bank until the two tanks were close enough to hear each other's engines. There was no room to maneuver for a flank shot when the range had already collapsed to 50 yards. And there was no time to reconsider a decision. Once the first round left the barrel, crews began describing the sound a bounced round made against a Panther's glacis plate, a flat metallic shriek followed by a half-second of silence, while every man inside the Sherman waited to learn whether the German gunner had found their position first. Some of those men were farm boys from Iowa, who had never fired at another human being before the 6th of June. Some were mechanics from Pennsylvania who understood engines better than they understood fear. All of them now carried the same private arithmetic in their heads every time a Panther appeared on a tree line. Weight, guess the angle, fire, and hope the round did something other than skip away into the next field. While Eisenhower absorbed the Isigny report, a 29-year-old American officer 400 miles to the north was finishing the last weeks of training his battalion in England. His name was Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr., Lieutenant Colonel, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, broad through the shoulders, with a habit of clamping down on an unlit cigar, whether he was smoking it or not. His men had nicknames for him. Some fond, some less so. But they all came down to the same observation. Abrams did not flinch. Through April and May of 1944, while the new 76mm Shermans sat idle in their depots, Abrams drove his crews through gunnery drills on the older 75mm model 7 days a week on Salisbury Plain and in the cold metal sheds where the tanks were serviced between exercises. He had read the intelligence reports. He had also read between the lines of them, and he suspected his men were going to meet Panthers, whether the reports admitted it plainly or not. What Abrams did not know, what almost no one at his rank yet knew, was that a partial answer to the Panther problem already existed. It had been engineered, produced in small quantities, and now sat waiting inside a quiet brick building outside Boston called Watertown Arsenal. Since the spring of 1942, ordnance engineers at Watertown had been developing a new kind of armor-piercing round, one that did not rely on a solid steel core to punch through enemy plate, but on something far harder and far rarer, a core of tungsten carbide. The project carried the experimental designation T4. Once standardized for service, it would be called the M93. To the crews who eventually fired it, it carried only one name, HVAP, high velocity armor piercing. The physics behind it were as elegant as they were brutal. A conventional armor piercing round defeated armor through sheer mass, a heavy steel projectile slamming into steel plate until it either broke through or did not. The harder the armor, the more mass and speed a gun needed to beat it. HVAP changed that equation entirely. Its Tungstenkarbide-Core, small and impossibly dense, rode inside a lightweight aluminum body and a thin ballistic cap. The core alone did the killing. The aluminum shell simply carried it down the barrel and kept it stable in flight. Because that shell weighed so little, the same 76mm gun could drive the round to speeds a standard steel projectile could never reach. Where the ordinary armor-piercing round left the muzzle near 2,600 feet per second, the HVAP round left it at nearly 3,400. In testing, that extra velocity meaningfully improved the odds of punching through a Panther's curved gun mantlet and other vulnerable points at ranges that had previously offered American gunners almost no chance at all. By July of 1944, when Eisenhower read the Isigny report, only a few hundred of these rounds existed anywhere in the world. The reason came down to a single word: tungsten. Tungsten is one of the rarest industrial metals on Earth. It melts above 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It is heavier than lead and harder than almost anything short of diamond. And in 1944, most of the planet's accessible tungsten sat inside two countries, China and Bolivia. The Chinese deposits, concentrated in Jiangxi province, had supplied roughly 36% of the world's tungsten before the war. But Japanese occupation of the Chinese coast had turned every shipment into a gamble through contested water. The Bolivian mines, high in the Andes, were steadier, but never large enough to fill the gap alone. American war planners in 1944 had three competing uses for every pound of tungsten that reached a refinery. The largest was machine tooling, the hardened cutting bits that shaped aircraft engines, gun barrels, and ship turbines across the entire war effort. The second was armor-piercing ammunition, not only for the 76mm Sherman gun, but for the new 90mm gun going into the M36 tank destroyer and the 90mm anti-aircraft gun being adapted for tank killing. The third, smaller but real, went into specialty armor plate, electrical contacts, and the filaments inside radio tube. In the spring of 1944, when the question reached Washington of whether to divert scarce tungsten away from machine tooling and into mass production of HVAP rounds, the answer that came back was no. Industry came first. That decision was made in air-conditioned offices by men who had never watched a Sherman burn. The men who would live with that decision were, at that same hour, finishing their own training 4,000 miles away, Captain James H. Leach commanded Company B of Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion. He was young, barely into his 20s, carrying the kind of quiet competence combat veterans learn to recognize from across a room. In the spring of 1944, his crews still drilled on 75mm Shermans, the same gun already failing in Normandy. He had heard rumors of a bigger gun. He had heard rumors of a tungsten round that could kill a Panther. None of it had reached his tanks in any form he could load and fire. His men would land in France within weeks, cross the same hedgerow country that had already broken the 75mm Sherman, and learned, the way every crew before them had learned, exactly how much that gap between promise and steel could cost. By the third week of July, 1944, the American situation in Normandy had passed from frustration into something darker. For 6 weeks, the armored divisions had bled into the hedgerow country, gaining ground measured in yards instead of miles, paying for those yards in burned Shermans and the bodies of 19 and 20-year-old crewmen from towns most of their commanders could not have found on a map. Every American tanker who had survived a brush with a Panther now carried the same private knowledge, learned the hard way and never written down in any manual. You could not kill it from the front, not with what they carried The new 76mm Shermans that Bradley had held back before the invasion were finally moving forward by the hundreds, paint still close to factory fresh, ammunition racks loaded with the standard M62 armor-piercing round. They had been promised as a solution. They were not one, not yet. They were better than the old 75, but better against the Panthers' front armor still meant the round bounced and the German gun answered on the morning of July 25th, 1944. The largest tactical airstrike in the history of warfare to that point shook the ground south of St. Lo. Operation Cobra had begun. 1,500 American heavy bombers, joined by hundreds of medium bombers and fighters, dropped their loads on a narrow corridor of German positions held by the Panzer Division, one of the most capable armored formations in the German army. Some of the bombs fell short. American soldiers died beneath their own air force that morning. Among them, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the officer who had shaped much of American ground combat doctrine, killed by a bomb meant for the enemy. He remains the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. The bombing itself lasted barely more than an hour. Yet the ground it struck looked, by the accounts of the infantry who advanced through it afterward, as though it had been reshaped by some force older and larger than any single weapon. Craters overlapped craters. Trees that had stood along the hedgerows for a century were reduced to splintered stumps. And the German units caught beneath the bomb pattern lost not only tanks and guns, but the wire and radio links that let a division function as anything more than a collection of isolated strongpoints. Panzerlinie, for all its reputation, could not fight what it could no longer see or communicate with. That collapse, more than any single American gun, was what tore the gap open south of St. Lo. The 76mm Shermans that poured through it were about to discover, within hours, that a broken German line was not the same thing as a beaten German tank. By afternoon, Panzerlinie had been broken, and American Sherman columns poured through the gap. More than 100 of the new 76mm tanks led the advance against Panzer IV medium tanks and German assault guns. The bigger gun worked exactly as promised against Panthers. The story stayed the same as it had been in June. American after-action reports from that week read strangely flat, almost clinical, as if the men writing them had run out of ways to describe the same disappointment. Tank commanders described firing at Panthers from 1,000 yards, from 800, from 500, and watching the standard round skip off the sloped front plate and vanish over the next hedge. Some crews learned to back their Shermans into orchards and let a Panther pass, then put a round through its rear deck at point-blank range once its back was turned. Some crews never got the chance to back up at all. One after-action report from those days, filed by a Sherman platoon leader whose name has been lost to the routine paperwork of a large army at war, described a single afternoon east of the breakout corridor. His platoon spotted a Panther at long range across an open wheat field and opened fire with everything they had, 5 rounds from 3 different tanks, all standard issue. Every round struck the glacis. Every round bounced. The Panther traversed its turret with the unhurried confidence of a gunner who had learned exactly what an American 76mm shell could and could not do to him, fired once, and put a round through the lead Sherman's hull before the platoon leader had finished giving the order to reposition. 2 men climbed out of the burning tank. 3 did not. The platoon leader wrote that his crews had done everything correctly, followed doctrine exactly as trained, and lost a tank and 3 men anyway, because doctrine had never accounted for the simple fact that their gun could not do what they had been told it could do. Behind the advancing spearheads, a different kind of war was being fought, one that history would mostly forget. First Lieutenant Belton Y. Cooper, 26 years old, served as a maintenance liaison officer attached to the 3rd Armored Division, and his job was one nobody ever volunteered for. He counted the dead tanks. Each day in the rolling country south of St. Lo, he drove a jeep behind the advancing armor, finding the Shermans that had been knocked out and judging what could still be saved. Some could be repaired, their crews carried off with wounds. They might survive. Many could not be repaired. And in those cases, the crews inside had usually not survived either. Cooper kept a notebook through the whole campaign, writing down what he found in plain, careful language, because plain language was the only way to make himself keep looking. Years later, he would publish what those pages held in a memoir he titled Death Traps. And the title was not chosen for effect. By the 2nd week of July, the 3rd Armored Division alone had lost dozens of Shermans. Some burned, others were pierced cleanly, killing the crew without ever igniting the fuel. Cooper wrote about the smell that clung to a burned-out hull long after the fire was out, and about the work of recovering men whose bodies had been reshaped by heat into something that no longer looked entirely human. Most of those tanks, according to his own accounting, had been killed by Panthers. As of that week, not one Panther anywhere in his sector had been killed by anything an American crew was currently carrying in their ready rack. Cooper's work was not glamorous, and it was rarely mentioned in the official communiques that made their way back to newspapers in the United States. He requisitioned replacement Shermans from depots further back and drove them forward himself when no one else was available, delivering brand new tanks to crews who had watched their previous one burn only days earlier. He noted, in the flat language of a man protecting himself from what he was seeing, that the replacement tanks kept arriving faster than the Army could train replacement crews to fill them. A new Sherman could reach a battalion within a week. A trained loader or gunner took months to produce, and there was no factory in Detroit that could manufacture experience. Cooper watched green replacements climb into tanks whose paint had not yet weathered, knowing that some of them would not survive their first engagement with a Panther long enough to learn what the veterans around them already understood in their bones. He kept doing the count anyway, because somebody had to know the real number, even if the real number never appeared in any press release. By late July, the situation could be summed up in a single hard sentence: the United States Army now possessed both a better gun and a better round to put inside it. Neither one had yet reached the crews who needed them. The gun had finally arrived in numbers at Cobra, at the cost of 8 weeks of delay that Belton Cooper's notebook could measure in burned hulls. The round, the tungsten cord answer built at Watertown Arsenal, was still crossing the Atlantic. In the first week of September 1944, a cargo ship finally docked at Cherbourg, carrying a shipment that had been chasing the American armored divisions across the ocean for 2 months. A modest batch of M93 high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, tungsten cord, stenciled with the Watertown Arsenal mark. Roughly 1,000 rounds in total for every American tank in the entire European theater. Distribution went down through the supply chain, the way it always does inside a large bureaucracy, a process that would feel painfully familiar to any man who has ever worked inside one. Army Group Ordnance divided the shipment among the field armies. The armies divided their share among the Corps divided their share among the divisions divided their share among the battalions, and the battalions divided their share among the companies. By the time the wooden crates reached the platoon, sergeants who had actually placed the rounds into a gunner's hands, simple arithmetic had ground the number down to almost nothing. 4 rounds per tank in most cases, 6 in a few, none at all in others. Crews were told to save them, use them only against Panthers and Tigers, never against a Panzer IV or an assault gun, and verify the target before firing, because once the 4 rounds were gone, there was no telling when more would come. Tank commanders began keeping handwritten lists tucked inside their breast pockets, a private ledger of survival, how many HVAP rounds remained in each tank of the platoon, which crew had already fired theirs and could no longer be trusted with a long-range duel against a Panther, which tank still carried a full 4 rounds and should be sent forward first if a Panther appeared on the road ahead. That was what the war had come down to for these men in the late summer of 1944. A war fought partly with tanks and guns, and partly with pencil marks on a scrap of paper folded against a man's chest. The rationing produced its own quiet arguments inside crowded tank turrets and around field kitchens after dark. A gunner who had gone 3 weeks without seeing a Panther might watch his 4 rounds sit untouched in the ready rack while a neighboring crew, thrown into a duel on the very first day, burned through their entire allotment in 90 seconds and had nothing left for the following morning. Company commanders found themselves making decisions that belonged, by any peacetime logic, to a supply officer rather than a combat leader, deciding which platoon most needed the tungsten rounds redistributed before an advance, and which platoon would simply have to trust standard ammunition and a favorable angle. Some men grew superstitious about their 4 rounds, the way sailors grow superstitious about a ship, refusing to fire them except at point-blank range where a kill was close to certain, saving them through engagement after engagement until the day finally came when nothing else would do. Ordnance officers back at depot level understood the shortage as a production and shipping problem, a matter of tonnage and convoy schedules. The men in the tanks understood it as something closer to rationed hope, doled out 4 rounds at a time, with no promise of resupply before the next crate happened to arrive. 400 miles to the south, George Patton's Third Army was running out of something even more basic than tungsten. Patton, 59 years old, profane and brilliant and famously impatient, had driven his armored divisions across France faster than any American force had ever moved before. By early September, his lead elements had reached the Moselle River. From the Moselle to the Rhine was less than 100 miles. From the Rhine to Berlin was a war-winning distance. If only the trucks could keep the tanks fed. They could not. The supply lines running back to the invasion beaches had stretched too far, too fast, and the Red Ball Express, the improvised convoy system built to keep Patton's spearheads moving, could not close the gap. By the middle of September, entire armored divisions were down to a few hours of fuel apiece. The Red Ball Express ran trucks nearly around the clock along a one-way loop of French highway reserved exclusively for supply convoys, drivers rotating through with almost no sleep. Engines pushed past any maintenance schedule. The vehicles had been designed for. Many of those drivers were black soldiers serving in transportation units, segregated by the same army whose spearheads they were keeping alive, running the same exhausting route night after night while receiving little of the public credit that later fell to the tank crews they resupplied. Even at full effort, the math refused to work. A single armored division under full advance could burn through tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline in a single day, more fuel than the strained road network could reliably deliver from beaches that were, by September, more than 400 miles behind the front line. Patton argued for priority over every other American army in the theater, certain that 1 more week of fuel would put him across the Rhine before the Germans could regroup. The fuel did not come. Eisenhower had other armies to feed and a broad front strategy to maintain, and Patton's spearheads slowed from a sprint to a walk at almost the exact moment they needed speed the most. The 4th Armored Division, Creighton Abrams Division, still had enough in its tanks to push across the Moselle and dig in on the far bank. They took ground near a small crossroads town called Ericourt and held it. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler studied the map of that bridgehead and did not like what he saw. He ordered a counterattack, and he had the tanks to try it. 2 newly raised panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, freshly equipped with Panthers straight off the assembly lines at Daimler-Benz and MAN, tanks so new that some still carried factory grease in places a combat crew would have long since cleaned out. Hitler wanted them thrown at the American bridgehead immediately. Push Patton back across the river. Buy time for the defenses now being dug along Germany's own western border. The order reached General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, 47 years old, a small and wiry officer, barely over 5 feet tall, who carried himself with the bearing of generations of Prussian officers before him. He had taken command of the 5th Panzer Army only days earlier, and he had not chosen this counterattack. Looking at the same map Hitler was looking at, he understood something the men in Berlin either did not grasp or chose not to. These 2 panzer brigades were not ready. Their crews had barely 6 weeks of training behind them, much of it conducted without enough fuel to run a full gunnery exercise. Worse, the brigade structure itself, designed personally by Hitler that summer, carried no proper reconnaissance units at all. The tanks were meant to move forward as an armored fist and smash through whatever stood in front of them by sheer weight of steel. That was the doctrine handed down from Berlin. Manteuffel sent the order forward anyway, because that was what an order from Hitler meant in the autumn of 1944. Whether a general agreed with it or not, the 2 brigades themselves told their own quiet story about the state of the German war machine by the autumn of 1944. A year earlier, a Panzer division, preparing for a major operation, might have trained for months. Its crews, drawn from experienced units, rotated out of the line to absorb replacements gradually. Its tanks broken in on ranges far from any enemy artillery. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades had neither the time nor the fuel for anything close to that standard. Many of the tank commanders were themselves recent graduates of officer courses shortened to meet the manpower crisis. Leading crews who in some cases had never fired their main gun outside of a classroom demonstration. Some of the Panthers rolling toward Ericourt had been driven directly from the railhead to the assembly area with barely enough kilometers on their tracks to be considered broken in. The brigades carried excellent tanks and thin experience, a combination that had rarely favored the side possessing it in any war. In Annizenturi, at Ericourt, on the American side of the line, Captain James Leach's Company B had spent the past weeks learning the lessons Normandy had already taught the rest of the Army. Only faster and at a higher cost than any classroom could have managed, his crews now carried the 76mm gun. His ammunition racks now held a handful of the new tungsten cord rounds, 4 to a tank in most cases. The same rationed math that governed every American company on the line. That autumn, they had also gained something. The newly raised German brigades across the river had not months of combat experience, a working knowledge of the terrain, and a habit of calling in artillery and air support the moment a target presented itself. None of that showed up on Hitler's situation map in Berlin. All of it was about to matter more than any single round of ammunition. On the night before the German attack, the forecast for the following morning called for fog, the kind of low, wet mist that rolls off the Lorraine Plateau in late September and does not lift until well past sunrise. Leach's men were briefed to expect Panthers moving through that fog at close range. And they were told exactly what Manteuffel already feared and what the crews inside those brand new German tanks had no way of knowing, yet in open country, at long range, with clear visibility. A Panther's superior optics and its long 75mm gun would win almost every duel against a Sherman before the American crew ever saw where the shot had come from. In fog, at close range, none of those advantages would exist. Only nerve, training, and the tanks 2 sides actually had in front of them at the moment the shooting started. Leach spent that last evening moving from tank to tank along his company's position, checking ammunition counts by hand rather than trusting the paperwork, making certain Every crew understood exactly how few tungsten rounds they had and exactly how much that scarcity meant. They could not afford a wasted shot. He kept his instructions short. Let the range close before firing. Pick the shot that counts. Do not waste HVAP on anything but a Panther's front or a Tiger, because the 76mm gun with a standard round could still deal with a Panzer IV or an assault gun well enough on its own. His gunners listen the way men listen when they already understand in their own bodies exactly what a bounced round sounds like and exactly what it costs. Some of them had fired those same standard rounds at Panthers in the hedgerows 2 months earlier and watched them do nothing at all. None of them needed convincing twice. By midnight, the company was as ready as 4 rounds per tank, and a summer of hard learning could make it. And the fog that Manteuffel feared and the American briefing officers were counting on had already begun settling into the low ground between the two armies, somewhere behind the American lines. That same night, a supply truck rolled forward carrying a fresh allotment of M93 rounds, the last resupply Company B would see before the fighting began. The crates were stenciled with the same Watertown Arsenal mark that had once sat sealed inside a laboratory outside Boston. Back when Creighton Abrams was still running gunnery drills on Salisbury Plain and had never heard the letters HVAP spoken aloud, 2 months, 1 invasion, and 1 broken breakout later, those same crates were being handed down a line of exhausted men in a cornfield outside a town in Lorraine that none of them had heard of a week earlier, and that every single one of them was about to remember in vivid and unwelcome detail for the rest of his life. The fog held through the morning of September 19, 1944. Just as the forecast promised, the lead Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade rolled out of that mist toward the ridge, south of the village, where Captain James Leach's Company B sat waiting in Hull, down positions, engines off, gunners tracking sound, more than sight, at a range of roughly 75 yards. Every advantage a Panther normally carried, its longer gun, its superior optics, its ability to kill a Sherman from a mile away before being seen, simply stopped existing at 75 yards in fog thick enough to swallow a tank hole. The fight came down to who saw whom first and who fired first. The Americans fired first. The lead Panther took a round through its turret and stopped, smoke leaking from its hatches. A second Panther, blind in the mist and hunting for the source of the shot, rolled past the wreck and exposed its side, where the armor thinned to little more than 1.5 inches. It took a round there and caught fire almost immediately. Within the first 10 minutes of contact, the 113th Panzer Brigade lost several Panthers and assault guns without ever fixing the American position well enough to answer effectively. Fresh crews, trained for barely 6 weeks, did what their limited training told them to do. They pushed forward into the contact rather than falling back to reorganize, and they lost more tanks doing it. The brigade's commanding officer was among the German casualties in the fighting around Ericourt in those first days. One of the highest-ranking officers lost on either side during the battle, though the precise circumstances of his death are recorded with less certainty than the battle's outcome itself. The fighting around Ericourt continued for 11 days. By the time it ended on September 29th, the 113th Panzer Brigade had been reduced from roughly 90 operational tanks and assault guns to fewer than 20. The 111th, committed in the days that followed, suffered similarly. Total German losses across the fighting numbered somewhere near 80 armored vehicles destroyed or damaged beyond recovery. The 4th Armored Division lost a fraction of that number in return. The exchange ratio was lopsided almost beyond belief, and in the years afterward it became tempting to credit the tungsten cord round for the entire result. The truth laid out plainly in the after action. reports filed by the men who fought it, was more complicated than that and more honest. The fog had done as much as any shell to win Ericourt, stripping the Panther of the long-range advantage it depended on and forcing green German crews to advance blind, in tight columns, straight into prepared American positions. The doctrine had done its share of damage too. Newly raised panzer brigades with no proper reconnaissance, no integrated infantry, and no air cover were never built to survive a fight like this one. Regardless of what ammunition waited on the other side of the ridge, American fighter bombers, flying through gaps in the cloud whenever the weather allowed, hunted German columns from above with rockets and machine gun fire, while fast and lightly armored tank destroyers used their speed to flank German formations, neither trained nor organized to counter that kind of maneuver. And the experience mattered as much as any of it. Leach's crews had been fighting since Normandy. They knew their machines, they knew how to read the ground, and they knew how to call in support the instant a target presented itself. The HVAP round was real, and it worked exactly as Watertown. Arsenal had designed it to work when the range closed and the angle was right, but it was one factor among several, not a miracle weapon that had single-handedly turned the tide. 2 months later, in an engagement remembered clearly enough to reach Army Ordnance investigators afterward, a Sherman crew from the 2nd Armored Division, commanded by Sergeant Francis W. Baker, a soldier with combat experience stretching back to North Africa, ran into a Panther near the outskirts of Aachen in late November of 1944. Baker's gun was a 76mm M1. His ready rack held more HVAP rounds than he had carried at any earlier point in the war. The Panther presented its flank at a range of roughly 800 yards, thin side armor, an angle that should have made the tungsten core's job almost trivial. Baker's gunner fired 7 rounds. All 7 struck the target. None of them penetrated. The Panther simply turned and withdrew without ever returning fire. Baker later described the scene to Army Ordnance investigators, who came looking for an explanation. The orange streaks of his own tracers curving into the German hull and skipping away at angles that, by every calculation his gunner understood, should have ended the engagement in seconds. He described the silence inside his own tank afterward, the disbelief in his gunner's voice, the slow and unwelcome understanding that the round they had been promised would save their lives could, under the wrong condition, simply fail. Metallurgists who studied reports like Baker's afterward concluded that some production batches of tungsten carbide cores had come out brittle, prone to shattering on impact at certain angles rather than punching through as designed. Manufacturing tungsten carbide to a consistent standard was itself a difficult art in 1944, requiring precise control of pressure and heat that wartime production lines, running around the clock with hastily trained workers, could not always guarantee. Batch after batch, a round that tested perfectly on a proving ground in Maryland might behave differently months later, after a rough Atlantic crossing and weeks jolting along French roads in the back of a supply truck. HVAP was a genuine advance in what an American tank gun could do. It was never a guarantee, and men like Baker learned that the hard way, in real time, with their own lives riding on the answer. Then came December 16th. 1944, at 5:30 that morning, roughly 1,600 German guns and rocket launchers opened fire along an 80-mile front through the Ardennes, a sector American command had considered quiet enough to rest exhausted divisions and absorb green replacement. Behind that barrage came 250,000 German soldiers, and the last fully equipped armored reserve Germany would ever field Panthers, Tigers, and the new King Tigers with their 88mm guns capable of killing a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The Battle of the Bulge had begun and it hit crews already stretched thin on tungsten precisely when they needed it most. The average 76mm Sherman still carried only about 5 HVAP rounds when the German attack opened, and low cloud cover held American fighter bombers on the ground for the offensive's first 8 days, stripping away the air support that had made the difference at Aracourt. In villages like Krinkelt and Rocherath on the northern shoulder of the German advance, American infantry and tank crews fought at ranges close enough for bazooka teams to disable Panthers from 20 feet away, holding the line with whatever they had left. Once the tungsten ran out and standard rounds were all that remained, the skies cleared on December 23rd. Within days, Allied aircraft found the German columns crowded onto the narrow Ardennes road network and destroyed them in numbers. The ground fighting alone never could have matched. The offensive already starved for fuel, ground to a halt. By late January, the front line had been pushed back close to where it started, at a cost of some 80,000 American casualties and roughly 100,000 German. It was the last major German offensive of the war, and what finally broke it was not a shortage of tungsten on the American side, but a shortage of gasoline on the German one. That shortage told the larger story better than any single engagement could. Germany had actually pioneered tungsten-cored ammunition years before the United States, fielding it as early as 1940 in calibers from small anti-tank guns up to the mighty 88. But Germany never controlled enough tungsten to sustain it. And by 1944, German crews facing American tanks were firing standard rounds almost exclusively, the tungsten reserved instead for the machine tools German industry needed simply to keep functioning. The idea was never a surprise to the Germans. What genuinely surprised them was that American industry, blessed with secure shipping lanes and ruthless production efficiency, could manufacture the round in quantities that actually reached a battlefield, while their own industrial base, battered by bombing and stripped of raw materials, no longer could. The number that decided the war in the West was not a penetration figure measured in feet per second. It was roughly 49,200. The total number of Sherman tanks of all variants American factories built during the war, set against roughly 6,100 Panthers built by Germany in the same years. An 8-to-1 ratio in steel alone. Before a single round was ever loaded, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams survived the war, went on to fight in Korea, commanded American forces in Vietnam, and became Army Chief of Staff in 1972. When the Army designed its next generation of main battle tank, it carried his name. The M1 Abrams entered service in 1980, firing depleted uranium penetrators built on the same simple principle. Watertown Arsenal had proven decades earlier in a brick building outside Boston, a small, dense projectile, driven at the highest speed a gun can manage, will defeat armor a larger, slower one cannot. That lesson had been paid for in hedgerows and cornfields and snowbound forests by men who carried handwritten lists of their remaining rounds in their breast pockets, men who watched a shot bounce off a Panther's flank and waited to see if the German crew would notice them first. Some of those men came home. Many are still in cemeteries across France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, in quiet rows that anyone can visit on any ordinary afternoon. The tungsten round was a real piece of how that war was won. It was never the whole of it, and the men who fired it always knew the difference. Even when the history books took decades to catch up,